The sun was setting over Crestview Knolls, and Marcus Clayton was the only irregular heartbeat in a neighborhood with a perfectly flat EKG. His hands, still dusty from a day spent designing sterile corporate landscapes, rested on the steering wheel of his pickup truck. He'd spent 8 hours forcing nature into symmetrical client-approved boxes. Now, he was coming home. The truck turned onto Sterling Circle. The change was immediate. The world softened, then stiffened. The harsh lines of commercial zoning gave way to something else. Something worse. Crestview Knolls wasn't just a neighborhood. It was a monument to conformity, a kingdom of beige. Every house was a variation of the same sand-colored box. Every lawn was a perfect emerald green rectangle, cut to exactly 2 3/4 inches. Not a dandelion dared to show its face. The silence was not peaceful. It was enforced. No children played on the immaculate grass. No neighbors chatted over fences. The only sound was the whisper of sprinkler systems, hissing like serpents in the twilight. Marcus's house was the last one on the cul-de-sac. It was the same beige box as the others, but that's where the similarity ended. Where his neighbors had pristine, empty lawns, Marcus had a garden, a lush, slightly wild explosion of life. A Japanese maple with leaves like crimson lace. Hydrangeas bloomed the size of dinner plates, ranging from deep blue to soft pink. And along the property line, a thick green wall of arborvitae hedges, his pride and joy. They were 8 feet tall, dense, and provided a sanctuary of privacy. This wasn't just landscaping. It was a rebellion, a quiet, growing revolution against the tyranny of beige. As he pulled into his driveway, he saw her. Barbara Henley. She was standing on her perfectly manicured lawn, holding a digital measuring device. She was pointing it at her neighbor's grass, her face a mask of intense concentration. Barb was the high priestess of beige, the self-appointed guardian of Crestview Knolls' soulless aesthetic. Her uniform was a crisp polo shirt and khaki capris. Her weapon was the HOA handbook. Marcus gave her a polite nod. Barb's eyes flickered from her measuring device to his truck, then to his garden. Her smile was thin, tight. It never reached her eyes. "Evening, Marcus," she called out, her voice syrupy sweet. "Your hydrangeas are looking vigorous this year." It wasn't a compliment. It was a diagnosis. Vigorous was HOA code for unruly. "Thank you, Barb," Marcus said, his voice even. He grabbed his lunch cooler from the passenger seat. "They like the soil here." Barb's gaze swept over his property like a searchlight. "I was just reminding the Petersons about the regulation of grass height. It's so important we all do our part to maintain standards." Marcus followed her gaze. Peterson's lawn looked like a golf course. It was perfect. But for Barb, perfection was a moving target. "I'm sure they appreciate the reminder," Marcus said, heading for his front door. He needed to get inside, to his own space, away from the oppressive perfection. He unlocked the door and stepped into the warmth of his home. The air smelled of earth and lemongrass. He dropped his keys in a bowl and went straight to the back window. His garden in the evening light was his sanctuary. The fading sun set the maple tree on fire. The hydrangeas glowed. The hedges stood as a silent, green guardian between him and the kingdom of beige. He poured himself a glass of iced tea and sat on the back porch, listening to the bees buzzing their evening prayers. This was why he put up with the HOAs and the Barbara Henleys. For this small piece of wildness, this quiet corner of chaos in a world of rigid order. He took a slow sip of tea. The peace was palpable. He had no idea it was already gone. 2 days later, Marcus loaded his camping gear into the truck bed. The morning air was crisp, carrying the scent of damp earth from his garden. He took one last look at his sanctuary, the maple leaves shimmering with dew, the hydrangeas standing proud, the hedges forming their green barrier. Everything was thriving. He'd been planning this solo camping trip for months. 3 days in the state park, where the only rules were nature's rules. No measurements, no violations, just trees that grew where they pleased. As he backed out of the driveway, he noticed Barb Henley watching from her kitchen window. She gave a tight, perfunctory wave. Marcus nodded back, trying to ignore the prickle of unease. He shook it off. Paranoia. The whole point of this trip was to leave all this behind. The highway swallowed him, and with each mile, the tension in his shoulders eased. For 72 hours, he was free. The truck tires crunched onto the gravel of his driveway Sunday evening. The sun hung low, painting the beige houses of Sterling Circle in a warm, forgiving light. Marcus felt the familiar weight settle back onto his shoulders, but it was tempered by the trip's residual peace. He stepped out of the truck, stretching his stiff legs, and then he froze. Something was wrong. The air didn't smell of earth and blossoms. It smelled of raw, shredded vegetation, like a lawnmower had vomited. His eyes scanned the property line. Where there should have been a lush, 8-foot wall of green, there were stumps. Ugly, knee-high, hacked-off stumps. His arborvitae hedges, 15 years of careful growth, were gone. He stumbled forward, his brain refusing to process the image. His Japanese maple, butchered. The branches that had arched so gracefully were now jagged, amputated limbs. The hydrangeas were decimated, their beautiful blue and pink heads lying wilted and brown on the dirt. His garden wasn't just trimmed. It was mutilated. Nailed to his front door was a bright yellow envelope. With numb fingers, he tore it open. Notice of HOA violation and remediation property, 142 Sterling Circle. Violation 47B, vegetation encroachment on common sightlines, non-conforming aesthetic. Action, remediation performed by Coventry Landscaping. Cost, $200, due in 30 days. The words blurred. Coventry Landscaping. Barb's husband's company. He stood there holding the paper, surrounded by the corpse of his sanctuary. The silence of Crestview Knolls was no longer enforced. It was accusatory. Marcus didn't remember walking to Barb's house. He was just suddenly there, standing on her perfect lawn, the violation notice crumpled in his fist. He knocked. Not a polite tap. A hard, sharp rap that echoed in the quiet street. Barb opened the door, her expression one of mild surprise. "Marcus, you're back early." "What did you do?" His voice was low, dangerously calm. Barb's eyes flickered past him to his property. "Oh, the remediation? It was long overdue, Marcus. Those hedges were a safety hazard, blocking sight lines for drivers. They were on my property, inside my property line." "The HOA covenants are quite clear about visual obstructions," she said, her voice taking on the rehearsed tone of someone reading from an invisible handbook. "We have a responsibility to maintain community standards." "Community standards?" He held up the crumpled bill. "You butchered my garden. You butchered a 15-year-old tree, and you're charging me for it?" "It's not butchery, it's maintenance." Her smile was thin and unwavering. "And the cost is standard for emergency remediation." This was not an emergency. When a resident refuses to comply with aesthetic standards, it becomes an emergency. She took a small step back, her hand on the door. "I suggest you pay the invoice, Marcus. Unless you want this to go to collections." She closed the door. Gently, but with finality. Marcus stood on her immaculate lawn, surrounded by the evidence of her power. The smell of his own destroyed garden carried on the breeze. He looked at the stumps, the butchered branches. Then he looked at Barb's house, perfect, sterile, untouchable. The peace of the camping trip was gone. In its place was something cold, something hard, something that would need a foundation. The HOA meeting was held in the community clubhouse, a sterile room that smelled of lemon-scented disinfectant and resignation. 20 folding chairs faced a long table where Barb Henley sat flanked by 2 other board members. The air conditioning hummed at a temperature just cold enough to be uncomfortable. Marcus sat in the back, the violation notice smooth in his hand now. He'd pressed it flat, trying to restore some dignity to the document that had destroyed his sanctuary. "Next item," Barb said, adjusting her reading glasses. "Violation appeal from 142 Sterling Circle. Mr. Clayton?" Marcus walked to the front. The eyes of his neighbors followed him. Some held sympathy. Most held the blank stare of people who didn't want to make waves. "Ms. Henley," Marcus began, keeping his voice level, "the vegetation you removed was entirely on my property. The arborvitae were planted 2 feet inside my survey line." Barb consulted a folder. "The covenants state that vegetation cannot impede community sightlines or present a non-conforming aesthetic. Your hedges violated both. They were healthy, well-maintained plants. Your definition of maintenance differs from community standards, said the board member to Barb's right, an older man named Bill who rarely spoke. Marcus felt the trap closing. You didn't notify me. You didn't ask me to trim them. You butchered them while I was away and sent me a bill. It was an emergent situation, Barb said smoothly. The board has discretion for urgent matters. An emergency? Marcus's control began to slip. An emergency is a gas leak. A fallen tree, not shrubs you don't like the look of. The appeal is denied, Barb said, gaveling the meeting back to order. The remediation stands. Payment is due in 30 days. Next item. The gavel hit the table with a final hollow thud. The sound echoed in the silent room. Marcus stood there for a moment, utterly defeated by the sheer bureaucratic absurdity of it all. He walked out of the clubhouse into the warm night air. The defeat wasn't just about the money, it was about the principle. The system wasn't just broken, it was weaponized. For 3 days, Marcus moved through his house like a ghost. The view from his back window was a raw, open wound. He could see directly into Barb's kitchen now. He watched her move about her life, unbothered. The anger was a cold stone in his gut. He thought about selling, about moving, but that felt like letting her win, letting the kingdom of beige claim another victim. On the third night, he sat at his kitchen table with the thick HOA covenant binder, the 387-page testament to control. He started reading. Not like a homeowner looking for a loophole, but like a surgeon studying anatomy. He needed to understand the system that had broken him. He read about fence heights, paint colors, mailbox specifications. The rules were exhaustive, obsessive. They tried to anticipate every possible deviation from uniformity, and then he found it. In Section 12, Paragraph C, Structural Definitions. Fences. Any freestanding structure erected for decoration or containment, not to exceed 4 feet in height. Retaining walls. Structures designed for earth retention or grade change. Must be engineered and permitted by the city. No height restrictions specified. The HOA had rules for everything meant to be seen. But they had no rules for something meant to be functional. They'd never imagined anyone would build something purely for utility. For privacy, a wild, impossible idea began to form. Not a fence, a wall, a retaining wall, for the slight grade change at the edge of his property. A wall that would be 7 feet tall, made of cinder block, permanent, unignorable. He stood up and went to the window. He looked at the stumps, then at Barb's house. The cold stone of anger in his gut began to heat. To Hardin, this wouldn't be a protest. It would be a statement, written in mortar and brick. He picked up his phone and called the city planning department when they opened the next morning. He had questions about permits for a retaining wall. The war wasn't over. It was just changing battlefields. The city planning clerk was helpful, if bored. Yes, a retaining wall required an engineering stamp. Yes, there were foundation requirements. The maximum height was typically 7 feet for a residential property line structure without additional review. The permit fee was $250. Marcus spent the weekend at his drafting table, not designing corporate landscapes for clients, but drawing his own defense. He designed a wall, a beautiful, brutal, simple wall, double-walled cinder block filled with concrete and rebar. It would be stronger than any house on the street. It would outlast him, outlast Barb. On Monday, he submitted the plans to the city. He didn't hide the address. He didn't hide the purpose. The permit was approved in 2 weeks. The engineer he hired complimented the design. Overkill for a 1-foot grade change, he'd said, but it'll stand for a century. The first delivery arrived on a flatbed truck. A load of cinder blocks dumped on his driveway with a roar of shifting weight. Then bags of mortar mix. Then rebar. The noise brought Barb outside. She stood on her lawn, arms crossed, watching. Marcus ignored her. He began organizing the blocks, the clinking sound of concrete on concrete echoing through the quiet street. After an hour, she approached. "What is all this, Marcus?" "Home improvement," he said, not looking up from the stack he was building. "You can't just build that." She gestured at the piles of materials. "I have a permit." He handed her the city-approved document. "For a retaining wall," She scanned it, her face tightening. This is outrageous. The aesthetics, it's a retaining wall, Barb. For the grade change, it's entirely within my rights. He picked up another block. The sound it made when he set it down was definitive, a period at the end of an argument. She stared at him, then at the growing pile of gray blocks. For the first time, she looked uncertain. She turned and walked back to her house, her pace quicker than usual. Marcus watched her go. Then he picked up another block. The first brick hadn't been laid yet, but the battle had already been won. The chalk lines Marcus snapped on the ground were sharper than any HOA boundary. They represented a different kind of law, the law of physics, of geometry, of load-bearing capacity. He mixed the first batch of mortar in a wheelbarrow, the gray slurry smelling of damp earth and finality. The first cinder block felt heavier than it was. It wasn't just concrete. It was a declaration. He set it precisely at the corner, checking and rechecking with his level. The bubble had to be perfectly centered. There was no room for error, no room for interpretation. This wall would be flawless. Thump, scrape, tap. The rhythm began. The sound of the trowel scraping mortar, the solid thump of a block settling into place, the gentle tap of the rubber mallet ensuring alignment. It was a meditative noise. With each block, the cold anger in his gut warmed, transforming into focused intensity. Neighbors began to notice. Cars slowed. Curtains twitched. Old Mr. Peterson from across the street gave him a hesitant thumbs up. A young couple walking their dog stared, their expressions unreadable. Marcus ignored them all. He was in a dialogue with the materials. The wall wasn't being built against Barb. It was being built for himself. For the sanctuary that was being reconstructed, not in greenery, but in immovable stone. By the end of the first day, a single perfect course of blocks traced the property line. It was only 8 inches high, but it was undeniable. A new reality was being drawn in the language of masonry. As he cleaned his tools, Barb emerged. She didn't speak. She just walked the length of the new foundation, her phone held up, recording, documenting, looking for a flaw. Marcus rinsed his trowel. Let her look. The only thing her camera would capture was perfection. The first new violation notice appeared in his mailbox 2 days later. Bright yellow like a poisonous flower. Notice. Unapproved construction materials stored in driveway. Violation of Covenant 22C. Marcus added it to a growing folder on his kitchen counter. He didn't stop working. The next day, another. Notice. Excessive noise before 8 a.m. Violation of community peace standards. The city building inspector came by on the 3rd day. A tired-looking man with a clipboard. He examined Marcus's permit, watched him work for 10 minutes, and nodded. Carry on, he said. Good, clean work. The following week, an official letter arrived from the HOA's law firm. Cease and desist all construction pending review of structure compliance with community aesthetic guidelines. This one required a response. Marcus spent an evening at his computer, drafting a letter he'd always wanted to write. He cited the HOA's own covenants, the city building code, and the specific permit number. He attached copies of everything. His tone was polite, factual, and utterly unyielding. He mailed it certified. The real turning point came on a Saturday morning. He was mixing mortar when a woman approached, Sarah, who lived 3 houses down. She held a cardboard tray with 2 coffee cups. I thought you could use this, she said, handing him one. I've been wanting to do something about my backyard for years, but... She glanced toward Barb's house. You know, Marcus thanked her. They didn't speak much. They didn't need to. Her coffee was a silent treaty. A recognition that he was fighting a battle others had been too tired to fight. The wall was now chest high. It was no longer just a structure. It had become a symbol. And symbols have a way of gathering supporters. The first week after the wall's completion felt like the morning after a revolution. The air on Sterling Circle was different, lighter, charged with a new kind of energy. The oppressive silence had been replaced by the ordinary, beautiful noises of life. Children laughing, neighbors chatting over fences, a dog barking. Marcus's backyard was transformed. The cinder block wall, once so stark, had already begun to soften. He'd planted creeping fig at its base, its tiny green leaves beginning their slow climb. The space within was his true sanctuary now, more private and peaceful than the Hedges had ever made it. Barb Henley became a ghost in her own home. She'd emerge only to get her mail or to hurriedly water her lawn, her movements sharp and hurried. The neighborhood watch walks had ceased. Her authority had evaporated, and the entire street felt it. The most telling change came when the "For Sale" sign went up in front of the Petersons' house across the street. But it wasn't a sign of defeat. Old Mr. Peterson came over to tell Marcus himself. "Not running away," he said, leaning on his cane. "My daughter's in Oregon. But I'll tell you what, the real estate agent says the wall adds character, makes the street feel more established. Can you believe it?" Marcus could. The wall hadn't destroyed property values. It had given the street an identity beyond beige conformity. It was a story. And people are drawn to stories. The kingdom of beige had fallen. In its place, something more human was beginning to grow. The letter arrived on thick, expensive stationery from the HOA's law firm. But this time, it wasn't a cease and desist. Marcus opened it expecting another battle. Instead, he found a single sheet of paper, notice of HOA Board Resolution 14C, retaining wall grandfather clause. The structure at 142 Sterling Circle is hereby recognized as a permitted non-conforming use. All future maintenance and ownership transfers shall respect this status. They'd surrendered. Not just given up, but formally codified his victory. The wall was now part of the official record. Immortalized. That afternoon, he walked to his mailbox and found the final piece of the puzzle. A bill from Coventry Landscaping. The original $1,200 charge for destroying his garden. He took it inside, sat at his kitchen table, and wrote a check. But in the memo line, he didn't write payment. He wrote, "Lesson learned." He mailed it without another thought. The anger was gone. The fight was over. The wall stood, and that was the only response that mattered. As he walked back to his house, he saw Barb watching from her window. Their eyes met for the first time since the wall had been completed. There was no anger in her gaze now, just a hollow recognition. She had tried to enforce conformity and had instead created a permanent monument to individuality. Marcus gave a small neutral nod. Then he turned and walked through his gate, into the privacy he had built with his own hands. The transaction was complete. 6 months later, Sterling Circle was unrecognizable. The "For Sale" sign was gone from Peterson's house, sold to a young family who immediately painted their front door a cheerful, violation-worthy yellow. Several other houses had followed suit. A blue door appeared, then a red one. Garden beds sprouted where there had been only lawn. The street had color. It had life. Marcus sat in his backyard, now a lush oasis against the gray wall. The creeping fig had covered one entire section. He'd built raised garden beds, growing vegetables and flowers in a happy, organized chaos. Sarah, from 3 houses down, came over for coffee, as she often did now. They sat watching bees buzz among the lavender. "You know," she said, "Barb's moving." "Her house went on the market yesterday." Marcus nodded. He'd seen the sign. It felt inevitable. "People are calling it the wall effect," she said with a smile. "The day we stopped being afraid to live in our own homes." That night, Marcus stood looking at the wall in the moonlight. It wasn't a barrier anymore. It was a foundation. For his peace. For the neighborhood's courage. Some people show you who they are by cutting down what you love. Others show you who they are by building something that can never be cut down again. He touched the rough concrete. Cold, solid, permanent. The wall was finished, but everything else was just beginning.